Record. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our course. I didn't want to resume this class as if nothing had happened, as if we could simply sort of pretend that nothing had happened. We could go back to the usual sequences of lectures. And I decided to begin this new phase with a new lecture, and that in fact has to do with my own research. So research that I've been doing on the history of the police in the early modern period that has yet again become quite relevant after the coronavirus crisis. Before I begin, I'm going to start sharing the screen. So if you can see this image and if you can hear me and see me, so please type on the chat box to the right of your screen, simply type your name. I would like to have a record of everybody that participates in this session. I just want to make sure that everybody has an access to an internet connection. There's going to be some noise here. My kids are playing just behind me. So the idea for today's lecture, I call it the history of the worst case scenario. And it's essentially a way to give you a broad overview of the ways cities and states dealt with the crises like the one that we are facing right now in the early modern period. In particular, we will focus on the 17th and 18th century and on the city of Paris. I began as one document that for me was extremely important that I found about 10 years ago. Is this book, The Public Health Legal Manual, that was published in 2001 in New York. It's a handbook for judges, lawyers, and public health officials to navigate existing state and federal laws in the case of large-scale emergencies, such as epidemics and terrorist attacks. And the manual asks and answers very thorny legal and constitutional questions. What is the applicable law during emergencies? When can emergency police powers be invoked? Who can establish curfew? What happens to due process when involuntary isolation and quarantine are required? Who gets to get a life-saving medicine if supplies are short? Again, very thorny question like this one. And the manual offers essentially a lean protocol for handling catastrophic events, essentially the worst case scenarios that until very recently we would normally prefer to see only in science fiction movies or in disaster movies. A reporter for the New York Times called this book very aptly the Doomsday Book. Now, the Public Health Legal Manual offers a sobering glimpse into some of the practices of control that condition modern life. That is, life in a society that is haunted by the question of security and that is increasingly defined by ubiquitous apparatuses of surveillance. And the manual, can you guys please mute everybody? The manual must be read. So it's an instance really of the new paradigm of security that is shaping contemporary life. And the manual must be read as a development in a longer trajectory, a history that revolves, I believe, around the notion of police. And a critical turn in that history occurred in early modern France, in the practices that the Paris police developed in order to control, discipline, and manage the city. And in the emergence of what was called at the time the science of police. So the project of police marks the first sustained effort to come to terms with the modern urban conditions. And in its attempt to understand and to avert catastrophes, both natural and social, the new science of police might be read as a pivotal moment in what is a yet to be written history of the worst case scenario. Now, the story, we might go back at the very least to the late Middle Ages, to the 14th century, the mid 14th century, with the famous Black Death. An epidemic that swept through Europe around 1347, 1348, and that wiped off more than a third of Europe's population. This is a painting, it's a later painting from the 15th century of the Triumph of Death, a fresco in Palermo. It was a crisis of enormous proportions. Again, a third of the population was died. A city like Florence, like my own cities, that at the time was one of the most populous cities of Europe, with something like 90,000 inhabitants, was reduced over several decades to only 40,000 people. In fact, the plague would reappear almost periodically for decades. So there were outbursts in 1348, 1363, 71, 83, in 1400, in 1407. So these type of epidemics were essentially chronic, and they will remain so until the 19th century. So throughout the early modern period, all societies were essentially affected, haunted by these type of problems. It's only in the 19th century, with developments with scientific developments and development in medicine, that so new theories about how contagion happened, and especially new drugs or new treatments and new medical treatments for diseases like cholera, that cities and states were able to finally cope with these epidemics. Venice, so Italy is particularly significant, so today, but also in the 14th century. The term quarantine that you've all heard in these past weeks actually comes from the Italian quaranta, which means the number 40. And this began as a practice in Venice. In Venice, when essentially ships, so these were measures taken, the quarantine was a measure taken in Venice in the late Middle Ages to stop the spread of the plague. Essentially, ships arriving to the city were required to anchor for 40 days before the crew could disembark. And then quarantine, so that acted, in the words of Geoff Mano, as a spatial buffer as well as a temporal buffer. It's a strategy essentially of separation and containment, and it was the most effective, the only one fundamentally available to contain these diseases. There were also other practices that were developed. And I'll go quickly through some of them, again, staying on the city of Venice. So not only were practices of control like quarantine developed, but also actual institutions were created, actual buildings were built to cope with this type of epidemics. The most famous type of this institution is the so-called Lazzaretto. A Lazzaretto, essentially a place to quarantine diseased people. This is we're seeing here the Lazzaretto Vecchio, built in Venice in the early 15th century, right off the Lido of Venice. There'll be a Lazzaretto Nuovo, also built in Venice a few decades afterwards, and Lazzarettos would be built in many Italian and European cities throughout the early modern period. I think this could also be related, so these strategies of separations and containment might also be related to other developments. For example, the creation of the ghetto of Venice. This has nothing to do with disease. In fact, the ghetto was established by a decree of the Doge of Venice in 1566. So it was one of the first places where people were forcibly segregated and surveilled because of religious difference. Jews were first segregated into the ghetto. The term originated here, the term that we still use in English, the term ghetto originated in Venice. The area that you see here in this Google map had been used as a foundry. Gettare, ghetto comes from the word gettare, the verb gettare, which means to pour, to found. And over time, the neighborhood corrupted the word into ghetto. The decree of 1516 stated that all Jews living in Venice must collectively move and reside in this area of the city, on the periphery, let's say, of the city. And the ghetto was essentially closed off. There were two doors to the district that were closed, locked at sunset, to ensure that the Jewish population didn't wander the streets at night. And again, this, as with the Lazzaretto, this was the first of many ghettos that would come to be established in Italy, in Europe, and in fact, across the world for centuries to come. Another image, also going back to the question of the history of disease, this is a famous painting by Nicolas Poussin, done at the moment of yet another major crisis, a major epidemic, a plague that spread through Italy and I think parts of Europe around 1628 or 1630. Again, just to insist that this question of, so this was a chronic ill of early modern societies throughout all the centuries that we're studying this semester. These were reoccurring, almost regular events that afflicted these societies enormously. Now, I want to start talking now about again, something closer to my own research, in particular to the city of Paris in the 17th and 18th century. It's a very interesting moment in urban history, especially because Paris, it's at this moment Paris began to grow demographically, and the city starts to become what today we would call a metropolis. And the growth of Paris and its population prompted the administration to develop a series of techniques of urban management, a series of practices to cope with this new urban condition, practices of police control, practices by which the administration tried to manage, regulate, and contain and discipline the city. And interestingly, in parallel to these practices of control, the police of Paris also developed what they call the science of police. So that is a discourse on how best to govern the city. And today I will trace some of the contours of this project of police, of this idea of what they call the ville policée, the policed city, the well-ordered cities. And the best way I found to introduce this subject is with a series of images by one of the most remarkable texts in this literature of police science, the memoir on the Reformation, the reform of the police of France, written in 1749 by a police officer named Jacques-François Guillotte, and in fact only published in 1974. It remained a manuscript. Very few people actually read it for 2 centuries. We know very little about this man. We know that he was a police officer, he was an amateur engineer, and for a time he was also friends with Denis Diderot, one of the most important philosophers of 18th century France. And it's a very interesting project because it's wonderfully illustrated, and it's a project of institutional reform. So he offers advice on how to transform the institution of the police, and offers a kind of fully fledged and terrifyingly prescient utopia of a police city, a kind of blueprint of what these police cities might be. So he calls, Guillot calls for a sweeping reform of the police. The key to the entire project is in this first vignette of the book, and the first line of the text, in this motto, divide et impera, Latin for divide and rule. He writes, the motto is relevant not only when it's a matter of governing a numerous people, but also when the issue is knowing it. The project's basic idea was to systematically divide the space, to partition space so as to understand it better, to know it, to fully know it. And indeed, the Guillot proposed to divide and subdivide the city and to thoroughly label all neighborhoods, all houses, all stairwells, all apartments, so as a means to render as precise as possible the identification of citizens. This is a map of Paris in this manuscript. So the first step is to redraw the actual boundaries, the administrative boundaries of the city. The quartier, the neighborhood, was the administrative unit of the city, and there were 20 of them. He proposes to increase that number to 24, to redraw their boundaries so that be neither too small nor too big, and each one is designated with a letter of the alphabet. Then he's obsessed, really, this man, with labeling every unit of the city. He wanted all buildings to be identified with the neighborhood letter, the street name, and the street number with a stone sign over the main doors. He wanted to label all stairwells and all apartments, all the entry doors of apartments. The logic is simple. So to systematically label all neighborhood houses and so forth was a means to render as precise as possible the identification of citizens. Again, he's obsessed with the identification. He wanted all carriages to be labeled with license plates showing the neighborhood number and a number, essentially a license plate identifying the carriage as well as the driver. He wanted even horses to be labeled. Every horse, these are horse collars that would identify whether the horse belongs to the city, to the suburbs, or to the provinces around. The key proposal of the city of the project concerned the organizational structure of the police. He wanted to reorganize the actual police administration, and he created a new figure that he called the syndic, a new type of police officer, and who would be in charge of issuing to every resident a new kind of document. He called it a certificate, a certificate. It's essentially the ancestor of today's ID cards. Every citizen would have his own certificate made that would list his name, his age, his social status, his address, the dates of entry and exit from the city, information on your taxes, and whether you own the carriage or not. And most important, the police would maintain an up-to-date copy, a duplicate of all certificates, so that the police chief would be able to know at any time where everybody in the city is. A problem of scale at this point emerged. Guillot thought that Paris had 1 million people in terms of population. Well, a more accurate estimate would be something like 600,000, never mind. So how do you manage an archive of 1 million paper? And our man Guillot had a very clever solution, a machine of his own invention that he called the serre-papier. It's a very ingenious filing cabinet that you see it here in all its Rococo splendor. And according to Guillot's calculations, every one of these desks that you see here would hold more than 100,000 certificates. He's very precise. He calculated everything. He calculated that you would need 12 of these desks to handle the city of Paris. Here we see the new police bureau that he imagined with 12 clerks, police clerks that manage the files of 1 million people under a giant map of Paris. The decor of this grand room hides a very remarkable apparatus with 12 wheels, 12 giant wheels that the clerks operate with their feet. It's a very stunning room, this thing, in which essentially these 12 clerks are maintaining an immense mechanical database of Parisians. The utopia of Guillotte. So this is a utopia of an all-knowing police. So that manages this immense archive of certificates, a prodigious repository of information on hundreds of thousands of people. It's a new image of the city that starts to appear here, a new understanding of the city, whereby the city is made by the archive itself, by the millions of information, millions of lines of information on the citizens that are methodically compiled by police officers. To use a very anachronistic term, this figure of the city, we could call it today computational. So the utopia of the police was not ultimately a matter of design, but a matter of knowledge, a matter of accounting almost. In this notation, in this new calculus of buildings, of streets, of people, is the origins of what I call a new kind of knowledge, a new rationality of the city. Now, to understand this project, so the logic of this project of urban control, of police control, we need to take a step back and to reflect on the very notion of police. In early modern France, the police encompassed a much broader range of meanings than it does today. Until the late 17th century, police did not refer to any single administrative agency. It did not stand for an actual institution, but more, Giulio, we'll do it later, for a set of functions. In fact, it's better to think of the term police not as a noun like we do today, the police, but as a verb, to police, which essentially meant to regulate, to manage, to govern. To police the city meant to look after the city's very life. The term police, I also want to stress, did not have none of the negative big brotherish connotations that it has today. The expression, for example, ville policée, the police cities, was never used to evoke the specter of what today we would call totalitarianism. On the contrary, it described an ideal condition, the condition of the city that was well governed, well ordered, civilized, and authors of all political persuasions used it in this positive sense. So here is a painting by Charles Lebrun, celebrating an important reform of the police that was led by Louis XIV and his chief minister Colbert in 1667. They took stock essentially of the city at that point that began to appear as a problem. The city, they took stock of an urban crisis. The city was dirty, polluted, crowded, unsafe, and unruly. And they led a reform that brought to the creation of a new officer, the lieutenant de police, the chief of police of the city of Paris, an institution that then over the next century will grow into a very powerful administrative and bureaucratic machine that established an ever more comprehensive regulatory regime for the disciplining of society and for the management of urban risk. So the painting that you see here, it's an actual painting. It's on the ceiling of the Hall of Miracles mirrors in the Palace of Versailles, and it depicts, it celebrates this 1667 reform. This is Safety of the City of Paris, its title. You see on the left is the figure of justice with sword and scales, and next to her is the figure of security, and in the background is the city. There is a scene of urban violence that you see there, and justice that essentially commands a group of police officers to intervene and to quell the violence in the city. So, and very interesting, not only would the soldiers, would these police officers bring to the city the military might of justice, they would also bring something possibly even mightier, light. The soldier at the center holds a spear as well as a lantern. And this is a reference to the most notable accomplishment of this 1667 reform, which was the creation of an unprecedented citywide service of street lighting, a first for European cities. The police installed some 2,000 lanterns throughout the cities, suspended, as you see in this image, over the middle of the street. This image, in fact, has nothing to do with street lighting. It really depicts another crisis, in fact, the financial crisis, a run on the bank after a financial collapse in 1720. But it so happened that it's the clearest image for showing how the lighting system actually worked, with lanterns suspended on those ropes on the center of the street. Yes.
We have a question. I don't know how you want to handle these, but a question from Christopher Orlando Baran asking, how did people react to the new system of policing? Did they like it or did they hate it?
We have, unfortunately, we don't have much, or at least I don't have much. I couldn't find that much information. It's very difficult to gauge popular opinion in the early modern period. It's not that we have access to, there were no newspapers, no polls. From the text that I read, that there is for many authors, the police are seen not as this threatening force, but in fact as a sort of reassuring presence. So again, to police the city meant, so was seen mostly in, for the most part, in very positive terms. Police officers were often seen as protectors of the people, not as oppressors, shall we say. Let me go back 1 second to the images. Here, two medals, again celebrating the two medals that were struck then to celebrate this reform. On the left, you have the figure of Paris that holds up a lantern. I mean, think of the radical novelty of this. You could finally go at night without fear of being robbed because you could actually see outside. So she holds up a lantern and a purse with money. So the city was now finally safe. Of course, this is the rhetoric of the government, but I think for the majority of people, this would embrace this kind of rhetoric. On the right, so notice also how Paris stands on a nicely paved floor, a reference to the fact that the police was in charge both of street lighting as well as street paving. And in addition to that, they also managed street cleaning and what today we would call urban sanitation. So they were not just law and order as we see today. They managed, they fulfilled many public functions, many public services that now are done by the Department of Building, the Department of Sanitation, no kind of municipal authorities. On the right, again, Paris that holds up a level and a wheel, again, a reference to the fact that the circulation on this newly paved street was now smooth and easy. And one of this question of circulation was a key concern for the police, so of easing the circulation of people and carriages, as well as the circulation of air. The specter for the police was what was called at the time the embarras, the congestion, traffic. Congestion was a critical problem. Here are two images of in which the city appears as a kind of crowded and chaotic spaces, with people pressing on one another, screaming at each other, fighting, a space populated by a multitude of bodies, laborers, thieves, a promiscuous, convulsed, even violent space. The embarras trouble the early modern administration. In many ways, the embarras, the bustle, the embouteillage, the congestion of the street posed a threat to the administration, which increasingly saw the city as a potentially explosive cauldron. And hence, they began to develop a wide range of practices for coping with congestion. So, for example, with multitudes of ordinances regulating street traffic and, for example, prohibiting double parking. The embarras signaled, again, it's not just a traffic accident was not for them just a minor disturbance in urban movement. It was at least potentially the sign of other much more threatening sorts of disturbances. The embarras signaled the disruption of social order. Social order and the control of traffic for police theories were not just closely related, but to one another, but also one and the same. If only the idea for them was that if only people, carriages, and goods were to circulate without difficulties, if traffic jams and other street disturbances were to be handled properly, the city and society itself would run smoothly. So behind this attention to these very prosaic matters of traffic was the desire to remove from the city all kinds of hurdles, all kinds of circulatory and social hurdles. The line for them, the line dividing the traffic jam from the riot was thin for them. Looming over the science of police was the threat of the ultimate social catastrophe. The science of police, I would argue, is a science of comprehending and organizing the techniques for the management of risk, the science of averting the worst case scenario. The police also intervened directly into the actual design of streets. In particular, it issued so-called alignment permits, like you see here. So they're handwritten permits that were required for anyone building a new building or renovating an existing one. Regularity was the goal. So the regularization of street layouts, so essentially to straighten up the city streets that were still largely medieval and tortuous in their layout. So regularity was the goal. All things out of crooked streets or building overhangs were suspect and potentially noxious. The goal was to remake the city, this dark and tortuous space of the city, into a well-ordered, well-lit environment. Alignment permits, again, required for all new constructions. In particular, the police took charge of, was especially concerned with alignment permits for buildings that stood at street intersections. And they usually gave the permit on condition that the owner build a pan coupé, that is, that the owner cut the building's corner. A few of these chamfered corners are still visible in Paris. This one that you see in the middle of the image is on the left bank, and another one, here's another one in the Marais. It's a tiny design detail, but very telling of how critical this concern for circulation was, how even a chamfered corner might help in preventing blockages and congestions. Again, in preventing that embarras that congestion that haunted the police, that signaled the disruption of social order. The embarras for them was an aberration, a kind of pathology of the city that needed to be fought against. And street alignments was the keystone of the police in trying to transform the city. Concerns for hygiene and public health were also paramount for the police. They're readable in countless police ordinances, like this one, that concerns, in particular, it's a prohibition for the sale of watermelons. Their seasons had passed, it's from September, their season had passed, and so the melons still in the ground will not have time to ripen, and hence eating them might cause disease, might cause dangerous illnesses. And police measures like this one for street cleanings or for the prohibition of certain foods that we call disease would be repeated every year regularly, sort of to accustom the population to this kind of practice. Another example of a police ordinance, this one calls for the installation of of signs with the names of streets, with details on the size, on the material, on the height of characters that should be used. A few of these signs, stone signs, are still visible in Paris. You can tell them for the old spelling of the word rue, street, with an umlaut. And here my favorite police ordinance that prohibited, reissued a number of times throughout the 18th century, that prohibited the use of kites, cerf-volant kites. Again, flying a kite was considered a safety hazard for passers-by. It could damage street lanterns, and it could also lead to what was called libertinage, so sort of immoral behavior. And it's a good illustration of how the various concerns for urban management, for infrastructure, for public safety, and even for public morality were routinely combined. Montesquieu, the 18th century philosopher, summed up nicely this logic, so the logic of these ordinances. He wrote in The Spirit of the Laws, matters of police are things of every instant, which usually amount to but little. The police is perpetually busy with details. So a pile of garbage in the street, a shop awning that projected too far into the street, or a traffic jam. Police theories saw all these hazards as entangled with one another, and hence as causes of potentially devastating chain reactions, countless emergencies that required countless emergency measures. The founding text of police science is this book, the Traité de la Police, written by a police officer named Nicolas Delamarre. It was throughout the 18th century, it remained the Bible of the police. It's a monumental multi-volume work published between 1705 and 1738. It's at once a history of the police, a compendium of police regulation, and the first methodical formulation of the principles and ambitions of the police. It's enormous in scope, 3,000 pages of text, hundreds of legislative, administrative acts, compiled references to scores of ancient and modern authors. We don't really know much about the author himself. The only image that we have of these of the foremost police theorists of the 18th century is late 17th, early 18th century, is a caricature. Here, Delamarre is depicted as a villain, basically, an early modern villain. In particular, he was responsible for the destruction of Protestant temples after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which had guaranteed religious toleration throughout the 17th century. And this is a caricature by a Protestant artist that depicts him as a crooked officer of the state. In his notes, here are some images from his manuscript notes on this monumental treatise on the police. He used an alternate title for his book, Code Politique, the political code. It's a very interesting title. It captures well the scope of Delamarre's ambition. He conflated police and politics, both derived from the Greek term polis. He essentially envisioned his work as the ultimate code of government. And in many ways, the Traité de la Police was exactly that, a comprehensive account of the range and complexity of the police, of the entire spectrum of activities subsumed under that notion. The radical novelty of this science of police, I think, can be gleaned in the maps that were published in this treatise. This is a map published in the volume that was devoted to urbanism, that would be published in 1738. It's a stunning map of the city's water supply system. It overlays the entire water system, the fountains, the water conduits, the water pumps, the water reservoirs, etc., onto an accurate map of Paris. And to my knowledge, this is the first infrastructural map of the city of Paris. So it treats fountains and water conduits not just as isolated artifacts, but in infrastructural terms, as nodes and links of an urban system. And I'd like to show you a few other maps that Delamarre published in his traité that I think are interesting to understand how he wrote the theory of the police. Essentially, he wrote the theory of the police by writing its history. And the history of the police was for Delamarre one and the same with the history of the city of Paris. In the book, he had the brilliant idea, essentially, of reconstructing the city of Paris, the history of the city of Paris, through 8 fictive maps or conjectural maps, going from the city of Lutèce, so a village before a village of huts, to the Paris that he knew, the Paris of Louis XIV. I'll run quickly through all them. So this is the first plan of the city. The second one with the Roman, showing the Roman imprint after the Roman conquest. And then he moves, so through archival research, essentially, he reconstructed the likely shape and size of the city over almost 2,000 years. This is the third. Fourth map, fifth map, Paris in the 14th century, the 15th and 16th century, the early 17th century, and finally Paris in 1702. It's an important series of maps, this one. It really marks a kind of leap of cartographic imaginations. Fictive maps of these that were now take for granted didn't exist before. So it's very interesting, this attempt to understand the city through time. And his fictional cartography was part and parcel also of a clear ideological program. So the problem here, the map yes.
Two questions whenever you get the chance.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the first question is a long time ago. It's from Hiba, and she's just asking who it was that funded these policing efforts. Maybe Hiba wants to be more specific in the chat a little bit later, because it may be that she was referring to specific efforts a little bit earlier on in the lecture.
I'll answer quickly this one.
And the other question is, from Abram, do you believe that this public service and governmental position creates a more ethical police force than our current form?
So about the funding, so the police as an institution, so this is a governmental institution, is funded by taxes. Very interesting, the work of police science, the work of Delamarre was funded directly by the king. So he had his own salary as a police officer plus a stipend in order to complete this monumental work. And at some point, because it became too laborious and people saw the actual need for this type of document, they figure out a system by which a percentage of ticket sales at theaters, at the Comédie Française and a few other theaters in Paris, was devoted to fund this project of police. Can you imagine going to the opera and having 2% or I don't know 5% of that of your ticket sale funding a police officer and his assistants are trying to compile this monumental work. About the ethical, so whether this project of police would be a more ethical way to conduct a business, I'm not sure if I can really answer that. I'm not trying to, again, I'm not trying to paint or to advocate anything here, a return to 17th century police practices. I'm trying not to make any kind of judgment on the, let's say, on the goodness, on the morality of these. For me, what's important, so more than asking whether this is moral or immoral, is really trying to understand how, again, to understand the origins of practices of control that continue to these days. To understand that, so essentially to understand that, so not to judge that history, not to pass a moral judgment on that, but simply our first task is really to understand what happened. If you want, I showed you earlier. So that picture of Delamare when he looks like an early modern Joker with the, dressed as a monk, as this kind of scary monk. Also, just to signal that for many people, like this was definitely immoral. So he was acting. So it's not so, or at least for certain groups of people, he was not seen, and the police was not seen as the protector of the people, but actually as the enforcer of, say, of censorship, or for example, of sort of religious bigotry, how shall we say. So he was literally responsible for the actual destruction of temples that had been built just outside the city of Paris in the 17th century. Can you tell me how, Oscar, how I don't have a clock here. What time is it? Oops, I don't see.
We have about 10 minutes left.
Okay. So back to this map. What I want to, so, and you can see it well in there. So it shows nicely the development of the city of Paris. And but what I want to claim is that it also offers a kind of a very particular view of the city of Paris and of the work that the administration in his mind did over the century to manage the city, to contain the city, and in particular to contain urban expansion. Urban growth was seen as potentially threatening. So the idea here is that if urban growth is not controlled, the city would essentially sprawl, and the police of the city, this is the constitution of the city, the very order of the city would be disrupted. Hence, in the map too, he tried to portray the city as essentially an object that over the centuries, French kings had administered and managed so as to render it order, so as to police it, so as to render it manageable. The graphics of these maps are also interesting. They strengthen sort of this reading of the city as an object that has been painstakingly controlled over the centuries. This is a notice, for example, how the draftsman drew the fortification walls. So essentially employing a consistently, let's see if I can point. Can you see my pointer? So these are the actual fortification walls in this at this point. And he also drew on all the maps in dotted lines the previous fortification walls, so that you can sort of read the growth of the city, the various, what he calls accroissement, the various enlargements of the city, as well as understand that, so understand this enlargement as ways to, again, plan the city. In my argument, that these maps offer, in fact, a paradigm of planning. The city in this narrative of Delamare is an object in need of constant guidance of attention. Left to its own devices, the city would grow badly. Today we would say it sprawled without planning, without the operation of enclosure, of periodic, so enlargement and enclosure of the city would lose its form, its coherence, its order, its police, they would say. And it's this dialectic between enclosure and expansion that was ultimately a dialectic between planned and unplanned development. A good comparison of this might be with a map, a very strange map from 1652 by a Danish cartographer, who juxtapose, so left and side, two maps of northern Frisia. It's the region now in the Netherlands and northern Germany. So on the left is the, on the right, sorry, is the land as it existed before the year 1240, a year when a powerful storm essentially ate away entire portions of the landmass and essentially redrew the region's coastline. So these cartographers used these fictive maps to gauge the extent of the damages brought about by this catastrophic event. So they're almost, this map is almost like a cautionary tale, illustrating the fear of what angry seas could do to a land. And Delamare's fictive maps that we saw earlier can also be read in the same light. So the fear, so this attempt to portray the city as always contained, and the fear essentially of what unregulated urban and population growth could do to this city. Behind his maps loomed the specter of a non-natural and yet equally cataclysmic event, the social catastrophe of what he called the dérèglement de police, when the city loses its order, its police. And the discourse on police, just to conclude on this, is essentially a discourse on risk, I would say. The work of the police is essentially an attempt to ward off a wide spectrum of urban hazards, food shortages, bread riots, urban violence, traffic jams, urban fires, urban blight, the dangers of polluted air and water, and moral dangers of all sorts. It was an attempt to deal with chronic urban hazards, but also with to respond to the new threats brought about by the big modern city. And underpinning that discourse is what I would call an anxiety of entanglement. That is to say that the idea and awareness that all problems were essentially interconnected, and the fear that each problem, if left untreated, could be the origin of escalating and potentially catastrophic chain reactions. The project of police was an attempt to manage the myriad problem of coexistence in a dense urban environment. And behind this project looms the threat of the ultimate social catastrophe. And my last two images just go back to the, again, food for thought, the serre-papier, so this paper holder, this giant mechanical database imagined in the mid-18th century by this police officer. And I like to juxtapose very anachronistically with a very contemporary image. This is the operation centers of the Prefecture of Rio de Janeiro, built in 2011 by IBM, by their Smarter Cities units. It's just one example of many similar operation centers that have been built by IBM and Cisco's and Microsoft throughout the world. New York City has a similar one. So in cities all over the world, you find similar images. I chose this one simply because it pairs nicely in terms of perspective and point of view with Guillotte, with our police officers. So the IBM Center gathers in real time all sorts of information, video streams, of the city's main streets intersection, information on the weather, etc. And the system integrates data from about 2,000 agencies. It collects data, it analyzes it in real time, looks for patterns and trends, with the goal of improving emergency response management and, say, handle traffic congestions or forecast flooding. So I wouldn't dare claim that the police officer of early modern France beat IBM by more than 2 centuries. Yet I think this juxtaposition can be productive. At the very least, it allowed us, I hope, to fully grasp the logic of the early modern police. The idea that planning is essentially the management of risk, and the idea that the project of the well-ordered city is ultimately a utopia of information. Now, that is all for me. Can I please ask all of you to type in the chat box your name so that I can have a record of who's present. I'm really concerned that everybody has access to an internet connection. Oscar, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that. Well, they're probably doing it again, but they've been doing that.
Okay, excellent. So on the slides, I won't show them now, but on the slides that I will post on our Dropbox, I also include 2 more slides with some quotation by an Italian art historian. His name is Tommaso Montanari. He's one of the most interesting and brilliant public intellectuals working in Italy right now. So it's from a recent article from last week. About the crisis that is unfolding right now in cities. They are, actually, I could show them at this point. Hold on 1 second. Montanari is writing about squares, the piazzas of Italy. I think they can, I found these words interesting, really, to reflect on right now. So not so much about the question, the history of the police or of worst case scenarios, but really on certain notions of architecture and public space. Perhaps in these hours, he writes, we understand that the public street, the church, the park are something more than simple containers. They are our common soul, our collective identity, the Middle Ages of communal freedoms, of cities whose air makes one free, build the piazza that to this day give form to our imaginary. And in the essay, he describes, he speaks of possibly the most beautiful of these public squares in Italy, the Piazza del Campo, the Piazza del Campo in Siena. Montanari also calls on a very famous painting by Giotto, at the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi. To represent ourselves is to represent our piazzas. When Giotto, in the upper church at the Basilica of Assisi, built the Italian pictorial language in the cycle of St. Francis, he painted the first recognizable image of an Italian piazza. This is a frame in which we see the first public consecration of Francis. And to make it legible, Giotto set the scene in a public space, not in a vague or an imaginary public space, but in the piazza of the commune of Assisi, that is, in what was the center of the city's public life. From Udine to Palermo, from the north to the south of Italy, there is no city or town, however small or poor, which doesn't have a piazza capable to remind us, even to those who cross it at a quick pace in these difficult days, that we are a community, that we have a project, and that project is called the common good. I found these words quite touching and quite relevant. These references to the late Middle Ages, to this pictorial tradition that sets these important scenes in the public square, and this tradition, very particular tradition, I mean, Italian, French, and European, of the square, of the piazza as the quintessential public space. And we realize now how much we miss that So in fact, we realize how much we miss, how important freedom is, how important public space is at the moment in which, only at the moment in which we are actually deprived of it. So that is all for me. Be well, and I'll see you shortly in the section. Thank you.